Matthew 25, Staying Ready for the King's Return. Welcome back, everyone, David said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet basement room as he set a fresh stack of papers on the center of the table. Last week, we watched Jesus stand on the Mount of Olives and untangle the destruction of Jerusalem from the ultimate end of the age. Tonight, we push directly into Matthew 25. It is vital to see that Jesus hasn't changed locations and he hasn't changed audiences. He is still sitting on that same hill, looking at the same disciples, answering the exact same question. If you look at handout sheet number 3, you can see the direct line connecting these sessions. Last week, in chapter 24, Jesus gave us the prophetic framework. He told us what to expect. Tonight, in chapter 25, he shifts entirely to the ethical application. He stops talking about what the world will look like and starts talking about how we should live while we wait for him. Jordan immediately found the page in his Bible, tracing his finger down the opening lines of the text. Right, the structural markers totally shift here. Chapter 24 was all about watching out for sudden traps and historical collapses, but chapter 25 introduces a completely different problem, the agonizing test of a long, drawn-out delay. Caleb looked up from the handout, tapping the timeline with his pen. So last week was about surviving the chaos, but this week is about surviving the boredom of the wait. It's like he's pivoting from a sprint to a marathon. Maya nodded in agreement, her eyes scanning the 3 distinct sections highlighted on the page. And if it's a marathon, the danger isn't just getting knocked off course, it's just running out of gas before the finish line. That is exactly where Jesus takes them in verses 1 through 13, David said, leaning over the table to point out the wedding custom breakdown on the page. The parable of the 10 virgins. In the ancient Near East, the groom's torchlit procession to the bride's house was the absolute climax of the wedding, and it almost always happened late at night. Jesus describes 10 bridesmaids waiting for this arrival, but the groom is delayed. 5 are wise and bring extra oil, 5 are foolish and bring nothing but their empty lamps. When the midnight cry rings out, the foolish try to borrow oil from the wise, but they're turned away, and by the time they get back from the market, the wedding door is locked shut. Arthur removed his glasses, his eyes crinkling with a knowing look as he tapped the side of his coffee mug. David, this speaks so perfectly to the flip side of those end times panics we talked about last week. Panic is easy because it's short-lived, but endurance is incredibly difficult. This parable isn't warning us about a sudden crisis. It's warning us about the slow, quiet spiritual burnout that happens when the wait takes much longer than we ever expected. Sarah nodded, a look of deep recognition crossing her face as she looked at the text. As a parent, I feel that fatigue in my bones. It's so easy to start strong, but keeping your lamp full, maintaining that quiet, internal spiritual life when you are completely exhausted by the mundane, midnight rhythm of the world, that takes a deliberate kind of wisdom. You can't borrow someone else's relationship with God when the door finally closes. And notice what Jesus does immediately after the wedding imagery, David said, gesturing for everyone to flip to the next section of the handout. He moves from a wedding to a marketplace in the parable of the talents. A wealthy master goes on a long journey and entrusts his estate to his servants based on their abilities. The first 2 servants immediately go to work, trade aggressively, and double the master's money. But the third servant gets terrified, goes out into the yard, digs a hole, and buries his single talent in the dirt to keep it safe. Marcus let out a short, sharp laugh, his business background instantly locking on to the economic scale of the story. David, people read the word talent today and think it means a special skill or an ability to play the piano. In the first century, a single talent was a massive unit of currency, worth roughly 20 years of a common laborer's wages. Burying money in the ground wasn't just lazy. In Roman law, it was actually considered the safest, most legally responsible way to safeguard someone else's property against theft. The servant thought he was playing it safe. Jordan chimed in, building on Marcus's point. Exactly, which makes the master's furious response so shocking. When the master returns, he doesn't praise the servant's caution. He calls him wicked and lazy. He expects his kingdom resources to be risked and multiplied, not preserved in a safe deposit box. Elena leaned in, her eyes scanning the text of the master's rebuke. This shows us that true faithfulness during the king's long absence isn't passive defense. If we spend our lives just trying not to mess up, burying our potential because we have a twisted, fearful view of a harsh master, we are completely missing the heart of the king. David smiled, watching the pieces connect across the table before directing their attention to the final, climactic vision of the chapter, starting in verse 31. Now look at how Jesus finishes this entire Olivet discourse. He pulls back the curtain on the final judgment, the Son of Man returning in glory, sitting on a throne, gathering all the nations and separating them precisely the way a first-century shepherd separates sheep from goats. Martha's face lit up, and she nodded encouragingly at Jordan before looking out at the rest of the group. That shepherd imagery is so beautiful, David, and it grounds the whole night. In the ancient Near East, sheep and goats grazed together perfectly during the day, but at night, the shepherd had to separate them because goats are less resilient to the cold and need different shelter. It was an intimate, daily routine for them. And look at the metric the king uses to separate them on that final night. It isn't a theological exam or a prophecy chart. He says, "I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I was in prison and you came to visit me." Jordan nodded in agreement, pointing to his open page, and both groups are completely shocked by the verdict. They both ask, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty?" The king answers that whatever they did or didn't do for the least of his brothers, they did directly to him. "Look at the brilliant trap Jesus just sprung on his disciples," David said, closing his Bible and looking around the table at Caleb and Maya, who were staring at the text in a quiet, sober realization. Think about the progression over these last 2 weeks. In the first half of chapter 24, the disciples are looking up at the sky, desperate for cosmic signs, military armies, and political timelines. But by the time Jesus finishes speaking at the end of chapter 25, he has completely redirected their gaze downward into the dirt. He takes their eyes off the clouds and forces them to look at the vulnerable, the broken, the hungry, and the lonely right in front of them. True readiness for the return of the King isn't about deciphering the secrets of the future, according to Jesus. It's about active endurance, risky stewardship, and radical love for the forgotten while we wait out the delay.